Ready to dive into something really interesting? Today we're exploring a connection that might surprise you. Anarchy and Christianity.
A surprising connection indeed.
We're looking at excerpts from Jacques Ellul's book, Anarchy and Christianity, and trust me, this is a thought-provoking one.
Ellul really makes you rethink things.
He does. See, it's easy to think of Christianity being all about empires and crusades and...
Right, the historical power structures.
Exactly. But Ellul says there's more to it. He wants us to look deeper, beyond that, to see this really radical thread within the core of the faith.
It's like he's saying the historical church and the actual message of the Bible, they don't always line up.
So you're saying there's a disconnect between what we often think of with Christianity and what the Bible actually says.
That's what Ellul argues.
Yeah.
And he starts with the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament.
Which, let's be honest, most people don't associate with anarchy.
You'd think strict laws, divine commands, not exactly a recipe for, well, anarchy.
Right, so where do you even begin to find it there?
Well, Ellul points to the periods right after the Israelites escape Egypt. They had leaders, of course, Moses, Joshua, but there wasn't this rigid top-down power structure.
Interesting. You'd assume with God as their leader, it'd be pretty, well, top-down.
You'd think so, but God's leadership, at least in this period, wasn't like a king dictating everything. Decisions often involve these tribal assemblies.
More of a direct democracy kind of thing.
In a way, it was about consensus, participation, even debate.
Wow. Collective decision-making in the desert. That's not the image that usually comes to mind.
It's a different perspective, right?
Yeah.
And even later, when they do establish a monarchy, Ellul's quick to point out how critical the Bible is of its kings, especially when they get a little too comfortable with their power.
It makes sense. Power can corrupt and all that. Do you have an example of that, like how the Bible critiques its leaders?
Oh, yeah. Take King Solomon, for instance. Remembered for his wisdom, right?
Right, super wise guy.
Except, Ellul reminds us that Solomon ended up imposing crushing taxes, built these lavish palaces. We're talking 700 wives, 300 concubines lavish.
That's a lot of lavishness.
And he even started dabbling in other gods.
Not exactly a model of good leadership.
The Bible's not shy about calling him out on it either.
Wow.
After Solomon dies, his son, Rehoboam, he basically tells the people, "My father was tough on you. Just wait till you see what I've got planned."
Oh, that's never a good sign.
Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well.
Oh.
The people revolt and the kingdom splits.
Talk about your consequences. But moving on to the New Testament, what about Jesus? I mean, he is all about peace and love, right?
That he is. And this is where things get even more interesting. Jesus, remember, he lived under Roman occupation. Things were tense politically and socially.
People wanting to fight back, I imagine.
Exactly. Some were all about violent revolution. But Jesus, he consistently chose a different path.
So he wasn't picking up a sword against the Romans.
No. He challenged the systems that created oppression, but not through force. He used his teachings, his actions, often directly confronting the religious and political elite of the time.
So more like a different kind of resistance. What did that look like?
Well, take the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. The devil offers him all the kingdoms of the world. Imagine that, all that power.
Hard to say no to that.
Right. But Jesus does. He refuses because he knows that worldly power, it often means serving the very forces he was there to fight against.
Wow. So even before his ministry really gets going, he's already making a statement about power.
Absolutely. And this carries through in how he deals with the Roman authorities, like that whole render unto Caesar story.
Oh, the one about taxes. Yeah, I've always found that one a bit confusing, to be honest.
It's often misunderstood. Used to say you have to pay taxes no matter what. But Ellul, he says there's something deeper there.
Okay, I'm listening. What does Ellul see in that story?
Well, when they bring Jesus the Roman coin, he points out Caesar's image on it.
Symbolizing Rome's ownership and all that.
It's exactly. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Ellul's point is Jesus is saying, go ahead, pay the tax. The coin already belongs to them. This isn't the real issue.
So it's not about blindly following the law, but more like
he's highlighting a deeper question. Why does this system even exist? Why does it demand allegiance? Why does it act like it owns things that don't belong to it?
Making you think, what does belong to God then? Where do you draw that line? So, if paying taxes is a distraction, what did Jesus highlight as important? What is it that belongs to God in this situation?
Well, according to Jesus, everything that doesn't have Caesar's face on it, our lives, our conscience, our very souls, those belong to God.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
For Ellul, it's a call for conscientious objection. And not just against military service, which was a big deal for early Christians, but against anything that tries to control and dominate in the name of God.
It's amazing how this simple story about taxes can lead to such a radical idea. Makes you think about other times Jesus challenged the status quo.
He did it all the time. Ellul talks about Jesus' trial, for example. The way Jesus dismantles the authority of both the Romans and the Jewish leaders, it's fascinating.
There's something about that whole trial, the way he handles himself. What does Ellul focus on there?
His silence. Jesus often refuses to play their game, to engage in their arguments. It's like he's saying, your whole system is so messed up, it's not even worth my time.
Like he sees right through them and their authority.
Exactly. And when he does speak, he often exposes their hypocrisy, like when he calls out the chief priests for acting like a mob, coming after him with swords like he's some kind of criminal.
And you can't forget that line to Pilate, you would have no power over me if it wasn't given to you from above.
Yes, a lot of people interpret that as Pilate's authority coming from God.
Right. But that doesn't really fit with the idea of challenging authority.
Ellul suggests a different reading. He thinks from above refers to something else, the forces of darkness.
Whoa, okay, now that's a new take.
It's like he's saying, you think you're in control, but you're a pawn in a much bigger game.
A little unsettling when you put it like that.
The idea of spiritual forces influencing earthly rulers, it was pretty common in early Christianity. You see it in Revelation, with the Roman Empire depicted as a beast controlled by a dragon.
Speaking of Revelation, it's not exactly known for being subtle.
Not at all. Ellul sees it as a full-on critique of the Roman Empire, and really of political power itself.
Right, like the fall of Babylon.
Exactly. It's not just a city. It's a symbol of a whole system built on greed and violence.
And Revelation does not hold back on showing just how destructive that system is.
It's a warning. Ellul thinks it reflects the early church's view of the state's suspicion, even hostility. He argues that early Christianity was, in a way, an anti-establishment movement.
Which makes it even crazier how the church later became so entangled with political power.
A strange turn of events,
yes.
Right? But Ellul points out there were always those within Christianity who disagreed, who continued to question the state's power.
Like who are some of these dissenters?
Well, Ellul mentions people like Tertullian, Fra Dolcino, even Francis of Assisi, people who lived their faith radically and clashed with the authorities. He believes there's this hidden history of Christian anarchism that continues to this day, even when it's not always visible or accepted.
It's amazing how these figures, across different times, were wrestling with the same questions about faith and power. So we have the Hebrew Bible, Jesus, Revelation, all suggesting that true faith and a worldly power don't mix. But what about Paul? He's kind of a big deal in Christianity. Where does he fit in all of this?
Good question. Paul's writings on authority, they're complicated and often debated. You have passages like Romans 13, where he seems to be saying, you should obey governing authorities.
You mean the part about, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God.
That's the one. And it's been used to justify all sorts of power grabs throughout history. But Ellul says, look at the context. Paul was writing to a community facing persecution. He was giving them advice on living in a hostile world.
So, not necessarily saying they should just blindly obey whatever the Romans threw at them?
Right. It's more nuanced. Ellul argues that Paul was walking a tightrope, trying to respect the law, while also being realistic about its limitations and how it could be misused.
How do you even balance those things? Respecting the law while acknowledging its limitations? So how do you balance those things? Respecting the law while acknowledging its limitations.
It's tricky, right? But even in Romans 13, Ellul points out that Paul stresses true obedience is to God, not to some ruler. And he also talks about praying for those in authority, even the ones who are oppressive.
Praying for them, that's interesting. It's not exactly rebelling, but it's not blind obedience either. What's the point of praying for those in power, especially if you don't agree with them?
Ellul sees it as its own form of resistance. It's like acknowledging that even powerful people are human, flawed. And maybe, just maybe, that prayer can spark some kind of change in them.
Trying to change the system from within, in a way.
Something like that. It's not about violence or confrontation, but it can be powerful.
And we can't forget, Paul himself was persecuted. He knew how brutal the Roman authorities could be.
Oh, absolutely. And Ellul points to other parts of Paul's writings, like in Colossians, Christ triumphing over all powers and authorities, spiritual and earthly. The idea being, true victory doesn't come from dominating others, but from living out love and justice, even when things are tough.
So we keep coming back to this theme. True authority isn't about worldly power. It's about aligning yourself with something bigger, outside of those human systems.
Right. And that's where Ellul brings in the idea of anarchy, often translated as no ruler or no domination.
Okay, that's a loaded term for sure.
It is, but Ellul's point is that true freedom isn't about getting rid of all authority. It's about recognizing where true authority lies. Not the government, not some external power, but within your own conscience, guided by love, compassion, all of that.
That's a powerful idea, but tough to put into practice. If the state isn't the ultimate authority, how do you live in a world that's still run by those systems? It's not like you can just opt out.
Ellul gets that. He's not saying there's some perfect utopia without any structures. He's realistic about human nature, how we want power, sometimes we're greedy, all of that. But he thinks we have to resist those urges, try to make the world more just, even if it's hard.
So it's more about finding a balance. You have to work within the system sometimes, but also try to create something different, something better that reflects what you believe in.
Exactly. Finding ways to live your values, even if those values clash with the way things are usually done. Ellul gives the example of early Christians, how they created their own systems of justice and helping each other, often completely separate from Roman law. They understood real change starts small, in communities with shared values, people who want something more.
Makes sense. So if we bring this to today, what does that look like? Living your values, creating alternatives. It feels like a lot to take on.
It doesn't have to be about some huge revolution. Ellul talks about everyday acts of resistance, like refusing to be part of something that goes against your conscience, supporting organizations fighting for change, creating different ways of educating, building community, even economics, even small acts, when enough people do them, can have a big impact.
It's hopeful, in a way. It means everyone has a part to play in making the world better.
That's the idea. Ellul might not give us a step-by-step guide, but he reminds us that questioning, resisting, even just imagining something different, it's all important. It's about deciding for yourself how you want to live, not letting the government or anyone else decide for you. It's about choosing love, compassion, justice, all those things.
Well, there you have it, a deep dive into the surprising links between anarchy and Christianity, with a little help from Jacques Ellul. Definitely got me thinking.
It makes you see power, authority, even faith in a new light.
It really does. We've covered a lot, and it's a lot to think about. If the state isn't the ultimate authority, then how do we figure out our own moral compass? What other ways of living together, governing ourselves, can we imagine? Big questions, and hopefully this conversation has given you some new perspectives, maybe even some hope, that a different kind of world, one based on love and justice, is possible. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and as always, keep diving deep.